The Census Bureau released the results of the 2020 census, which revealed that in the US, white people seem to be slowly disappearing. Last year, the white population in the country declined for the first time in census history. Here's a quick look at how America's demographics have changed over the last 2 decades.
Go back just 2 censuses ago. This is 2000, turn of the century. The country was almost 70% white. You could see about 12% Hispanic. This is what it looked like 20 years ago. Now, in the last census 10 years ago, this is how much things changed in the first 10 years of this century. The white population went down to under 64%, a growing Hispanic population, a growing Asian population. So the question was, in 2020, how much more would things have changed when it comes to these demographic categories? Well, the answer is changed a lot more than people were expecting. Take a look at this. Now, with the new census, the numbers out today, the white population in the United States, not only is it under 60%, it's well under 60%, 57.8% white.
Yeah.
The Hispanic population continues to grow. That's nearly 20% now, getting close to 20% a Hispanic population. The black population's pretty level. In the Asian American population, it continues to grow, now basically at 6%. So the diversification of America is continuing.
So, for right-wing Great Replacement types, census confirmation of the declining white population was probably the stuff of nightmares. For others, it was cause for celebration. For instance, Michael Moore, the progressive filmmaker and author of the 2001 book Stupid White Men and Other Sorry Excuses for the State of the Nation, tweeted, "The census data collected from the 2020 census was released today, and it revealed that the number of white people in the US has fallen for the first time since the first census was taken in 1790. In other words, best day ever in US history." So the assumption here, which I think is shared by many liberals, is that our nation is finally going to move in a more enlightened and progressive direction once America's reactionary whites are outnumbered by their browner counterparts. As the thinking goes, more non-white people automatically translates to more Democratic voters. The term for this is demographic destiny, and this idea was perhaps most famously put forward by Democratic strategist James Carville in his 2009 book, 40 More Years, How the Democrats Will Rule the Next Generation. In his book, he argued that America's diversifying and increasingly liberal youth voters would secure a lasting Democratic majority. But is it actually a surefire bet that younger, non-white Americans are a lock for the Democrats? If recent trends are any indication, I wouldn't be so sure. You might remember that after the exit polls of the 2020 election, these polls suggested that Trump actually increased his share of non-white voters from 2016, despite regularly being called a racist and a white supremacist by the media and by activists. Early analyses indicated that in 2020, Trump made gains with men and women of every minority group. In certain areas, such as in a number of border towns in Texas, the shift to Trump was particularly pronounced. Now, of course, let's be clear, the majority of Black, Latino, and Asian American voters still cast ballots for Joe Biden over Trump. 92% of Black voters, 59% of Latinos, and 72% of Asian Americans voted for Biden. So because of this, after last year's election, a number of liberal commentators refused to talk at all about the people that shifted to Trump, or they wrote them off as politically insignificant. To cite one example, New York Times columnist Roxane Gay wrote, "Too many white liberals will obsess over early exit polls indicating that 20% of Black men and a significant number of the overly broad categories of Latinos and Asians voted for Mr. Trump. They'll do this instead of reckoning with how more white women voted for the president this time around and how white men remain the most significant demographic of his base. They will say that once more, Black women saved America from itself, which of course we did, even though some things don't deserve salvation." So I personally believe this line of thinking is a mistake. Since the 2020 election, we now have even more evidence that Democrats are losing a non-negligible number of working-class voters who are not white. According to the data firm Catalyst, which, by the way, no relation to Jacobin's sister publication Catalyst Journal, in 2020, working-class people of color shifted to Trump at an even greater rate than their professional counterparts. As the Pew Research Center found, 41% of Latino voters without a college degree voted for Trump, compared to only 30% of Latino voters with a college degree. To put it another way, 81% of Latino Trump voters did not have a college degree. So, the reason it's important to pay attention to this now is precisely because of the same demographic changes that Michael Moore and others have been celebrating. As the non white segment of the population grows, Democrats absolutely cannot and should not take these voters for granted. Political scientist Rui Teixeira has estimated that since 2012, running against Trump twice, Democrats have lost 18 points off of their margin among non white working class voters. So, how exactly should Democrats respond to this ongoing erosion of their former coalition? Well, for one thing, instead of doubling down on never ending culture wars, which unfortunately is often their specialty, Democratic politicians who seriously want to win should start paying attention to what exactly matters to this ostensible base. Take a look at how one voter responded to last year's Democratic messaging.
Biden beat Donald Trump among Latinos by 2-1, a critical margin. But it was the president who increased his share of the Latino vote compared to 2016. And that was crucial in key states.
Democrats sort of thought that the Latino community would naturally be drawn to their party given the negative rhetoric by Donald Trump.
Everyone thinks that if you're a Latino, that you're a Democrat and you're for open borders. And I don't see that, but a lot of Latinos most of them that I know, got here the right way. And so we care about a lot of other things other than just immigration.
And it's not just one person. This also bears out in the data. As Rui Teixeira put it recently, the reality of the Hispanic population is that they are, broadly speaking, an overwhelmingly working class, economically progressive, socially moderate constituency that cares above all about jobs, the economy, and healthcare. For example, in the post-election wave of the Democracy Fund Voter Study Group panel survey, well over 70% of Hispanic voters rated jobs, the economy, healthcare, and the coronavirus as issues that were very important to them. No other issues even came close to this level. Crime as an issue rated higher with these voters than immigration or racial equality, two issues that Democrats assumed would clear the path to big gains among Hispanic voters. So the funny thing is that despite what the media sometimes suggests, economically progressive, socially moderate constituency that cares above all about jobs, the economy, and healthcare actually also describes a significant portion of Black voters, Asian American voters, and in fact, working class voters of all races. Surveys consistently show that Democratic-leaning working class voters list their top priorities as healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, the economy, and jobs. And what might be just as significant for the Democrats, both now and in the future, is that these are also the same priorities of many non-voters. When surveyed, non-voters of all races are actually more likely than voters on the whole to express support for unions, raising the minimum wage, and increased government spending on healthcare, public education, and the social safety net. In other words, there's actually a pretty clear way forward for Democrats and progressives to build a winning coalition in the years to come. But they'll never do it by sitting around and simply waiting for demography to run its course.
Yeah, I mean, it's always funny when you realize that the Joe Biden won the election because of a huge swing in white male support for him compared to 2016.
White men saved us? No, I'm just kidding.
They saved us. They saved us. Yeah. I think, I worked at Univision before many years ago, and it gave me like an interesting look inside what we would call kind of the Latino voting bloc or the Hispanic voting bloc or whatever, and I think that there's just a tendency from a lot of liberal commentators to assume that there's a very similar dynamic to what's going on with Black voters. And I just think that there's just a fundamental misunderstanding in that there is some level of coherence to the Black experience in America, that there is a sort of a lot of unifying things in that just is completely absent from Latinos, broadly speaking. I mean, I think people forget this is not like ancient history. I mean, people are talking about the swing for Latinos for Trump, but in 2004, Latinos voted for George W. Bush almost almost at 50%. You know,
Mhm.
like he got about almost 50% of the Latino vote, which would have been unthinkable in say 2012,
Mhm.
and now it's starting to swing back. So it's just a much
Same for
more
Asian Americans.
right. It's much more, you know, fluid and up for grabs voters than a lot of liberals give them credit
Assume.
for in
Yeah.
a way. Yeah, assume.
I think that the up for grabs is kind of the key here, right? And I think that this is where the Democrats very often, or what I was trying to get at by, trying to debunk this idea of demographic destiny is that it's not that these voters are naturally conservative, as, you sometimes hear like Republicans try to say about
Yeah.
like Catholic Latinos or like model minority Asians or whatever. Like, oh, this is a natural constituency for us because like these groups have like, conservative family values or whatever. No, I mean, sure, maybe some, I mean, that can describe like literally anybody probably, but the point is that these groups are up for grabs. I also want to add that Democrats like don't campaign to these groups very hard, to be honest. I've mentioned this on the Jacobin show before, so like maybe I sound a bit like a broken record, but something I think about a lot is that Bernie Sanders won California in the primaries. California is the most populous, most diverse state in the union, and part of the reason why Bernie won is not because Californians are just so progressive that they flock to him. The reason he won is because he had a killer ground game early and, with a lot of enthusiasm in the beginning of the race. He campaigned very heavily among Latino and Asian American working class voters. And as a result, I mean, lots of people don't bother campaigning to those groups at all because they're thought of as non-voters. So it's like, I don't know, it's kind of like, a vicious cycle of why would we reach out to them? They're not going to vote. Bernie sort of broke that mold where he was like, I'm going to actually campaign to these people. I'm not going to do it in like a freaky or like extra woke way. I'm just going to, talk about bread and butter issues. And it worked. Both of those groups turned out in droves for Bernie, voted for him. I mean, I know that Asian Americans voted for Bernie over Biden in California by a margin of like 2-1. I think with Latinos, it was even more. I think that like, I don't know what the numbers are off the top of my head, or like, I forget, but like, it was, like, I mean, the point is that like these groups are not necessarily inherently conservative or inherently liberal. The point is that you have to campaign to them.
Yeah, and as Matt Bruning is pointing out in the behind the scenes chat that he ran up the score with Latinos in Nevada as well.
Matt.
And Asians. There you go. Don't forget about the AAPI, Matt. Come on.
That's right.
I canvassed for Bernie in Spanish during the last election. I'd made phone calls for Bernie in Spanish in the last election. I talked to a lot of like older Mexican people and things like that. And I remember like talking to like a very old sounding grandma in Spanish. And I was like, hola, estoy llamando de Bernie Sanders, whatever. And she's like, sí, Bernie. Yes, sí. My niece, she tells me that he cares about us. He cares about us. So, yes, I'm going to vote for him. And I'm like, oh, great. That's nice. Like you see, like he showed in a way that felt very authentic that he actually cared and that he actually was campaigning for their vote. And I think that was a huge part of why he was able to get so much support. I think that, again, people, the black vote with Democrats and how it's over 90%. I think that a huge part of that is that there are a lot of black voters and that there is a black leadership class that kind of did deliver real gains for people.
Mm-hmm.
The people, like there's a lot of black voters that remember civil rights or shortly after the civil rights pieces of legislation, and there was a lot of black politicians who were around at that time that were part of that movement and delivered those gains and therefore have a huge amount of credibility. There's just no equivalent for the Hispanic vote. I mean, the last the biggest immigration amnesty in recent times was Ronald Reagan in 1986, and it was Bill Clinton that militarized the border after NAFTA. Mm-hmm. So there just isn't an equivalent version of it. Like, but as Ruth Teixeira points out, because they're working class, because they are more progressive on economic issues, they still vote Democrat in majorities. But that's not a guaranteed thing if they don't do anything for them, if they don't deliver any concrete gains.
Right.
There's no reason why they won't go Republican.
Or if during campaign season, the Democrats like keep hammering on the culture war stuff and don't actually foreground the bread and butter issues, like I see that as being a political failure too. So
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.